And being sloppy or indifferent or careless about numbers is not an expression of true caring for people. When America decides to stabilize her population, she will be teaching the world that numbers matter because people matter. And the world is long overdue from learning that lesson. And who better to teach it than us? Now, I'd like to move into the title of this talk tonight, The Liberal Case for Reducing and Controlling Immigration. We liberals have certain traditional goals in common. We believe in protecting the jobs of the working poor and minorities. We believe in reducing economic disparity, in supporting environmental sustainability, expanding the middle class, blind justice to all, not even the president is above the law, and fighting international exploitation. These are all goals that we believe in. And the fact is, the immigration system that we have today, which was largely created by liberal politicians, undermines and defies every one of these goals. Now, what I'd like to do now is start with a brief history of immigration to America, because this story that we are a nation of immigrants is one that is very close to our hearts. So let's take a closer look at that story and see how it got created. In 1870, American workers were among the best paid workers in the world. Our wages were 136% the wages of Europeans. And it was from this position of strength that labor unions began to organize. In response to the labor union movement, employers decided that their best strategy would be to expand the labor pool. So they went to Europe, they advertised American jobs, and they paid steerage for those workers to come to the United States. What started as a trickle in the early 1870s rapidly took off as immigrants began to write home and tell their families what a good deal it was to come to America. And by the year 1913, the wage disparity between Americans and Europeans had been cut in half after about 4 decades of a massive increases of new foreign workers. We had large immigrant ghettos in every one of our cities, characterized by disease, poverty, prostitution, alcoholism, and crime. And there were a lot of very nasty feelings being directed against immigrants from Native Americans, native-born Americans. And it was not a happy time in our nation's history. Between 1900 and 1910 was the Great Wave. Now at this time, about 900,000 immigrants a year were coming. And it was a sink or swim proposition. It was a very hard thing to survive in this country. And all of the taxpayer-funded programs that we have available today for immigrants and the working poor, none of those were available at that time. No free health care in the emergency rooms, no food stamps, no public housing, no free interpreters or bilingual education. None of that was available. And 1/3 of the people who came during the Great Wave returned to their native land. So when we look back and we say immigrants built this country, we are talking about a group of people that withstood a very grueling experience with exceptional self-reliance and exceptional pride in becoming Americans. Now, at this time, we had a growing immigration restrictionist movement. The rich favored these immigration policies, poor and minorities and labor leaders did not. To give you a flavor of the kind of debate that was happening at this time, I have some quotes from some of those leaders. This is from Samuel Gompers, who was the founder of the AFL-CIO. America must not be overwhelmed. Every effort to enact immigration legislation must expect to meet a number of hostile forces, and 2 hostile forces of considerable strength. Corporation employers who prefer a rapidly revolving labor supply at low wages to a regular supply of American wage earners at fair wages. and the other is composed of racial groups in the United States who oppose all restrictive legislation because they want the doors left open for an influx of their countrymen, regardless of the menace to the people of their adopted country. Samuel Gompers. I'd like you to just focus briefly on that one phrase, a rapidly revolving labor supply at low wages, because I'll return to that later. And this from Frederick Douglass, African-American abolitionist. The old avocations by which colored men obtained a livelihood are rapidly, unceasingly, and inevitably passing into other hands. Every hour sees the black man elbowed out of employment by some newly arrived immigrant whose hunger and whose color are thought to give him a better title to the place. At this time, there was such a clamor coming from the public in the early 20s to reduce immigration that Congress wrote a series of laws known as the Quota Laws. What they did is they looked at the census in 1890, and they saw that the majority of Americans were descended of Europeans. And they could see no reason why we would want to deliberately introduce racial, cultural diversity in this country. And so they wrote an immigration policy that continued to favor migration from Europe. Between 1925 and 1965, we averaged 178,000 immigrants a year. So think of this, 900,000 a year at the turn of the century and 178,000 through the middle of the 20th century. Now, it was during this period of very tightly restricted immigration that virtually everyone's income in America rose, and we really created the middle class during this period. It was an especially successful time for immigrants because those that had come in during the Great Wave came out of their ghettos, they got their businesses off the ground, they were phenomenally successful. And by the year 1960, our feelings toward immigrants had completely changed. We began to describe ourselves for the first time as a nation of immigrants, and we elected the grandson of an Irish immigrant to the White House, which would have been unthinkable in the year 1900. Now, this period of very restricted immigration was also very good for African Americans because when northern factory owners no longer had access to European workers, they went into the South. And we had a great diaspora out of the South as blacks came north to take the relatively much better paid jobs in the blue-collar industries. So that by the year 1940, 13% of African American families had incomes above poverty. But by 1970, 70% of African Americans had incomes above the poverty line. In just 3 decades, they achieved this meteoric rise. And they did this in the face of Jim Crow laws, institutional racism, and without any help from whites whatsoever. It happened because labor markets were tight and immigration was restricted. I want you to notice how much of an improvement we have had since 1970. And when you think of all the wealth that we have created in this country since 1970, that 8% rise is pretty pathetic, isn't it? By the year 1965, we were in the middle of the civil rights movement, and we looked at those old immigration laws, and everyone realized, oh my gosh, they only let in white people. That's not the kind of country we want to be. So everyone was in agreement that we wanted to rewrite the Immigration Act of 1965. And we can look back, we can read what people were saying in Congress at that time. And on 2 points, everyone was in perfect agreement, Democrats and Republicans. We had no intention of increasing immigration. President Kennedy himself in his book had said, this is not a plan to increase immigration. You know, the country has been settled. And the second point was we wanted a colorblind immigration system.